For over 300 years, they lived on a string of islands so remote, so cut off from the mainland, that time itself seemed to slow down around them. No roads reached them for generations. No outsiders truly understood their language. And when geneticists finally got permission to test their DNA, they didn't just confirm a story historians had been telling for a century, they found something almost nobody expected buried inside it. This is the real, scientifically documented story of the Gullah-Geechee people, and what their DNA actually reveals about where they came from. Stretching along roughly 12,000 square miles of coastline, from Pender County, North Carolina, down through South Carolina and Georgia to St. Johns County, Florida, lies what's now officially recognized as the Gullah-Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. The people who call this string of barrier islands and marshland home are the direct descendants of enslaved Africans brought to work the rice, indigo, and Sea Island cotton plantations of the lower Atlantic coast, starting in the late 1600s and continuing through the era of the transatlantic slave trade. Historians estimate that between 45 and 65% of enslaved Africans brought into what became the United States passed through the port of Charleston alone. That single number means something staggering. A large share of Black Americans today, regardless of where their family lives now, can trace at least one ancestral thread back through this exact stretch of coastline. But the Gullah-Geechee are different from most other African American communities in one critical way. And that difference is exactly what made them a genetic goldmine for researchers. The Sea Islands were surrounded by tidal marshes, winding rivers, and dense maritime forest, a natural barrier that made them brutally difficult to reach by land. Plantation owners, meanwhile, often fled inland during the hot, disease-prone summer months to escape malaria, leaving enslaved communities to run the plantations largely on their own for months at a time. That combination, geographic isolation plus reduced daily contact with white overseers, did something almost no other enslaved community in North America experienced at this scale. It allowed West and Central African cultural practices to survive relatively intact for generations. Language patterns, storytelling traditions, spiritual practices, foodways, and even specific agricultural techniques, especially the highly specialized knowledge of rice cultivation that many enslaved West Africans brought with them, persisted here in a way that got diluted almost everywhere else. By the time linguists and anthropologists started seriously studying the Gullah language in the 20th century, they found something remarkable: entire words, grammatical structures, and story patterns that matched languages spoken thousands of miles away, on the other side of the Atlantic. For decades, the leading theory pointed to one specific region, Sierra Leone. Linguists found that around a quarter of Gullah vocabulary shows striking similarity to Sierra Leone's Creole language, similar enough that, according to researchers, present-day Sea Islanders and Sierra Leonean Creole speakers can actually understand each other in conversation. Songs traced back to the Mende ethnic group. Counting systems echoed the Fula people of Guinea. Even the name Gullah itself has been linked by some researchers to Gola, an ethnic group associated with Angola. Historical shipping records reinforced the theory. Rice planters in colonial South Carolina specifically sought enslaved people from West Africa's Rice Coast, the stretch of coastline including Sierra Leone, where sophisticated rice farming had been practiced for centuries, because they had exactly the agricultural expertise the plantations needed. It wasn't a coincidence. It was targeted, deliberate sourcing based on skill. So historically, culturally, and linguistically, the case for a strong Sierra Leone connection looked airtight. Then geneticists actually tested it. A landmark genetic study published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology took on this exact question. Researchers analyzed whole genome data from Gullah individuals, compared it against African American populations from Jackson, Mississippi, against population samples from Sierra Leone, and against broader African and European reference panels, essentially building a genetic map to see where the Gullah truly sit. The results confirmed part of the story, and complicated the rest. First, the confirmation: the Gullah showed significantly higher overall African ancestry than non-Gullah African Americans from the same region, along with lower European admixture. Their population also showed a slightly closer genetic relationship to Sierra Leone than other African American groups did. So the linguistic and cultural clues weren't wrong. There really is a stronger than average Sierra Leone genetic signal here. But here's the twist: researchers didn't expect to state so plainly. Despite that closer relationship, the data showed the Gullah are genetically connected to many West African populations, not overwhelmingly dominated by any single one. In other words, Sierra Leone contributed meaningfully, but the ancestry is a broad mosaic pulled from across West and Central Africa, not a narrow, single-origin bloodline the way the popular story sometimes gets told. Then there's the detail buried deeper in the science, the part that turns this from a confirmation story into a genuine surprise. When researchers sequenced mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, they found that the overwhelming majority of Gullah maternal lineages traced back to African haplogroups, exactly as expected. But mixed into that data were rare outliers, at least one individual carrying a Native American maternal haplogroup, and others carrying deeper, non-African maternal lines entirely. On top of that, the broader genome-wide study found something else worth sitting with: the European ancestry present in Gullah genomes wasn't evenly distributed. It was male-biased, meaning it entered the population disproportionately through the paternal line. Researchers also identified what's called a population bottleneck roughly 13 generations back, a sharp, temporary drop in genetic diversity consistent with the trauma and displacement of the slave trade itself, a bottleneck the Gullah share with non-Gullah African Americans, tying their story to the much larger history of forced migration across the entire American South. Put simply, the DNA doesn't just tell an African origin story, it tells a story of trauma, forced contact, isolation, and survival, written directly into the genome, generations later, in ways historians could only previously infer from documents and oral history. Today, over 1 million people in the United States may have some ancestral connection to the Gullah-Geechee, many without even knowing it. And here's something worth knowing if you're curious about your own ancestry: standard commercial DNA tests won't hand you a neat little label that says Gullah-Geechee. Instead, your results show up as broader regional African ancestry, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Cameroon-Congo, and similar categories, because DNA companies map ethnic regions, not cultural identities. Genealogists researching a possible Gullah connection typically combine DNA regional matches with historical land records, church records, and surname research tied to specific Sea Island communities like St. Helena Island, home to the historic Penn Center, one of the first schools established for freed people in the United States after the Civil War. The culture itself, meanwhile, is fighting its own battle for survival, not against distance anymore, but against rising coastal property values, development, and younger generations moving away for work and education. Community leaders describe watching a centuries-old way of life shrink in real time, even as scientific and historical interest in it has never been higher. So when we ask what the DNA of the Gullah-Geechee really reveals, the honest answer is layered. It confirms centuries of oral tradition and linguistic detective work pointing toward Sierra Leone and the broader Rice Coast of West Africa. But it also reveals a population shaped by far more, a wide mosaic of West and Central African origins, rare and unexpected genetic threads from outside Africa entirely, and the unmistakable genetic fingerprint of forced migration itself. The Gullah-Geechee didn't just preserve African culture in isolation on these islands. Their DNA shows they preserved something even harder to erase, a record, written in their own genome, of exactly what their ancestors survived to get here.